I think it is complicated. I mean, ecosystems are complex. They vary from place to place. They vary through the year. And I think there's so many pressures on the natural environment from urban expansion, from farming and agriculture.
There is, of course, also a culture that you need to sort of be able to demonstrate that you get some value out of the investments that you are making. And with the metrics, we are actually able to demonstrate that in a different way than what was possible in the past.
Hi, and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, the podcast about architecture, urbanism, landscape, cities, but also real estate and urban development trends, because this is the topic that I started this year, and it is done together with Urban Land Institute Denmark as we embarked on this collaboration on this podcast series. Together, we aim to connect industry professionals, start conversations, and also explore the ideas shaping the future of our cities. This is episode number 2 of our series, in which we will talk about the impact of biodiversity and Biodiversity COP16. In today's episode, we will dive into one of the most pressing topics in urbanism, cities, and sustainability. We will be talking about biodiversity. We'll explore how this UN Biodiversity 2024 conference, or COP16, influenced global policies and its impact on industries, especially here in Denmark, but also, for example, in the UK. And we will be talking about those two countries because I will be joined by two incredible guests offering those unique perspectives from those two countries. First of all, Samantha Deacon, who's the global lead for biodiversity and ecosystem at Ramboll, who will share insights into the measurable metrics driving biodiversity efforts worldwide. And the second guest is Mette Lassesen, who is the Europe Director for Environment and Health at Ramboll, who will shed light on the importance of biodiversity for urban planning, how concepts like blue and green infrastructure can transform our cities. And Mette is also the part of Urban Land Institute Denmark. So today, we'll discuss how COP16 brought biodiversity to the forefront, the progress made, and the challenges that are still ahead. From bigger global frameworks to local action, I hope we will give you some inspiration about how can we protect and restore our nature. Let's get started. Let me start then, and I just wanted to say, Sam and Mette, welcome to Urbcast and welcome to the ULI Denmark and Urbcast podcast series.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We'll talk today about biodiversity and how to measure biodiversity and how different events, conferences like COP16 for biodiversity can support that mission. But before that, I would love to get your personal approach to biodiversity. How did you get to work with biodiversity, environment, and health? So how does it influence you on the personal level?
Maybe I can go first there, and then you can chip in, Sam, afterwards. So, well, first of all, I'm personally responsible for environment and health in Ramboll at a European level, and also for sustainability globally. And having worked within the space of sustainability for many years, biodiversity or nature has been part of that equation for a long time. And for quite some years, I and we in Ramboll have worked also with concepts around livable cities. And, topics like blue-green infrastructure as part of that. So in a way, nature, biodiversity has been part of that whole drive for quite some time. I would then say at a personal level, I love my garden and sort of personal experiences around what it actually means to be outside, in the garden or in nature, how nourishing it is. I think everyone can relate to that. So there's also sort of a very personal connection to nature and to biodiversity coming from that. I don't know how you feel, Sam, but I think it's probably along the same ways.
It is, yeah. So I've always loved nature right from a young age. And I studied biology at university. I went on to study to specify in ecotoxicology. So that means I can get quite excited about pollution. And I'm really, through my job, I'm really passionate about raising awareness of the biodiversity crisis and wanting to help protect nature and restore our ecosystems. So that's what drives me every day, makes me leap out of bed.
Great that there is this passion embedded in your work as well. There is a saying that goes that if you will work with passion, you will not work a single day because you will do what you love all the time. Let's dive into the topic itself, because I think that what is important to emphasize is that today we'll discuss COP16, which is this conference of parties, but specifically dedicated to biodiversity, to biological diversity. So that's something that we need to emphasize at the very beginning. And the COP16 edition just took place some time ago, and we wanted to summarize this today with you and think about how it influences the industry and also what is the outcome for measuring the nature. Because in your LinkedIn post, Sam, after the conference, you said that at the business level, nature targets must be measurable, science-based, and actionable. I really wanted to dive into that. Why should we talk about measuring nature? And how exactly is COP16 contributing to that discussion?
We've been losing our biodiversity. In my lifetime, from 1970, we've lost nearly 3/4 of our populations of wildlife. And COP16, well, the COP meetings are there to bring the governments together and to try and agree some major policies and decisions to help protect and restore our planet. That's on the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs. And I think whilst COP16 was useful, and there were many positive conversations that came out of that, it didn't quite meet all of our expectations. But my understanding from talking to the Danish Minister for the Environment, that those conversations are continuing. So I hope we will still see some progress. But I think in terms of, we haven't focused on measuring our ecosystems in the past. So we've had policies around conservation, but they've been on particular species, protecting particularly rare species. And I think that's failed us. So now we're starting to shift more to protecting the whole ecosystem that those species depend upon. So if you protect the habitat, so where those organisms live and sleep and breed and eat, then you're protecting the species as well. So it's protecting that whole habitat. And there was a lot of talk at COP16 around metrics and how you measure nature. And I think we should be using metrics because that will help us measure nature, and what you measure, you can manage. So the saying goes. And this is how we can then start to see and track our progress against these big policy targets that are in the Global Biodiversity Framework, for example. We can start to measure nature and measure the habitats where our wildlife live. We're hoping then to turn the tide so that we move away from this business as usual and we actually start to see this transition where we not only protect nature so there's no net loss, but we go even further than that and we can get into a net positive situation for nature. And that's what we're aiming for and aspiring for, is this nature positive outcome.
I would love to develop the topic of what happened at COP and why some aspects of it were successful, but some weren't. But also I was wondering why a company such as Ramboll would be present at such an event. So in other words, why such an event is actually needed.
I think for Ramboll, it is important to be present at events like that, exactly as Sam is saying, because there are some very important conversations taking place there. And you could say, of course, there's a whole political negotiation track, which we are obviously not part of, but we follow it very closely. We follow it so that we can also talk to our clients about, what is coming up, what is next, where is the trend going. And we use such an event to meet with our peers, to meet with our partners, to meet with the greatest thinkers, the thought leaders in this arena, We hope that we also are, in some instances, ourselves perceived as thought leaders in this arena, Sam herself being one of them. So I think it is important for us to be there, to be part of the conversation, and also provide our expertise and our technical knowledge, our insights into the conversation. And I think especially, what Sam was referring to before with the metrics that we have been promoting, and you can talk more about that, Sam, the work we've been doing in that arena very specifically, because we did launch a set of global metrics at the latest COP. It is really, taking that sort of scientific approach to it. So moving it away from, you could say a little bit, the do good, which of course we do want to do good, but we also want this to be scientifically based so that we make sure that we do the right things at the right time, and that actually that you can prove, or at least hope to prove, that you are indeed moving in the right direction. And we believe by being able to measure that makes it easier for private companies, for instance, to make a difference here. And that's what we are pushing for. But maybe, Sam, you want to sort of complement.
There's a lot of legislation, particularly in Europe, coming through for corporates to demonstrate and disclose their sustainability. And biodiversity is obviously a key part of that. And in order for those companies to evidence their claims, they need to be able to measure. And so that's where metrics are incredibly important, to see where those companies are today in terms of their impacts and their dependencies on nature, and then where they want to be in the future and help that transition. And by measuring that change, they can then report against or set targets and then report against them. So yeah, it's incredibly important, I think, even more so now with the greenwashing directive, that companies are able to truly evidence what they're doing.
And also, I think, just again, a lot of our clients and the companies that we work with, there is, of course, also a culture that you need to sort of be able to demonstrate that you get some value out of the investments that you are making. And with the metrics, we are actually able to sort of to demonstrate that in a different way that was possible in the past. And I think that also is valuable for the people working in the area of sustainability, that they can take those conversations into the C-suite or into the boardroom, because they can actually demonstrate the real value here in a different way. And that is proving, at least for many of our clients, to be very, very useful.
Let's talk about some of the tools that you can use to start this dialogue about biodiversity. I think that one of those important elements of COP is the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal. Could you explain what this framework is about and how does it help with your work?
Yes, so that sets these really big global targets that all the signatory countries, of which there's about 200, can all aggregate around and agree to. And so in 2023, was it, 2 years ago, at COP15, those targets, those 4 broad goals were set. And they were around protecting 30% of the earth and the seas for nature, and by 2030, and that's sort of known as the 30 by 30 plan. We are still quite a long way away from that, although in time we're only 5 years away, aren't we? But we're a long way from reaching those goals. So when they were set, we only had 17% of our land and 10% of our marine areas were under protection. So, less than, about a half and a third. So we've still got some way to go on that. We also wanted our financial institutions to shift away from funding harmful activities, so government subsidies that are behind harmful activities. And that was costed out at $500 billion that we need to phase out. And then on the flip side, we need to create $200 billion for funding for restoration and biodiversity protection. And I'd say one of the main targets that fell under the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is important for us and our clients, relates specifically to business. And that's target 15. And that requires all large companies and financial institutions to monitor, assess, and disclose their risks and their opportunities on nature through their operational sites. So that's at specific locations. It's also through their supply chains and their portfolios. And that's a real shift that I've seen in the last few years. I've been doing this a long time. I've been a practitioner for 30 years now. But I think shifting the emphasis to supply chains and those what might be seen as, or not seen as, hidden costs to nature in manufacturing, for example, and sourcing materials, raw materials, is new for business. And it is a real shift, but that is where the greatest impacts to biodiversity can happen. So we've been, businesses have been operating under environmental permits for many years. We're all used to that. But this value chain piece is new and a real sea change.
Can you say also how it translates into the daily life? Because being part of COP16 or the conferences before is voluntary, so only the parties that are very committed and interested attend. And similarly can be, as I understand, with the framework, that is some set of recommendations, but not something that companies are forced to do. How do we make sure that the companies see the value in it and that they follow those rules or suggestions and recommendations?
It's actually business that's been really pushing for this. So when the policymakers, the governments were sat around the table, and as the clock was ticking towards Christmas at COP15 when the framework was agreed, it was business there lobbying and pushing for agreement. So I don't think they need to be encouraged. I think they're already there and they're doing this and they're leading the way. So whilst COP16 that happened in October in Colombia, took place, it had mixed outcomes. Still, business was present and pushing the agenda, and the financial institutions. So I think really it is down to business and financial institutions to drive this now. I think government should be stepping up, and they should be creating the policies and the frameworks for this action to take place. But the action will be taken by business and financial institutions.
I think there are also, certainly some countries that are and have been moving ahead. The UK, where you said, Sam, is a country where, and you can talk about that if that's of relevance, where you've had legislation put in place, which also is driving this agenda. And of course, as Sam was referencing before, there is also legislation coming through from the European Union, including some of the reporting initiatives that is pushing for this. And also, there's also the science-based targets for nature, which is also an initiative that is moving ahead, which more and more businesses are looking at. So I think there are multiple initiatives at different levels that will also be pushing this, which will have a direct impact on both the private and the public sector.
The European legislation, Europe is leading the way, I would say, in terms of legislation. So we at Ramboll, we are a global company, and we have offices and business in the US, for example. And the European legislation is driving action in the US. And the US is not part of the COPs, well, the Biodiversity COP anyway. But businesses there are still taking action and starting to drive towards this nature positive transition because of the legislation in Europe. So where we have global companies with a strong presence in the US, they are also taking action because of that European policy and legislation.
To close up the topic of COP16, you said that you left it with mixed feelings. Why was that? So there was some implementation progress, but there's obviously some challenges remaining.
Yes, so I think there was a lot of positive conversations, and we heard some really nice, encouraging and ambitious stories from companies. I think where we fell short was around the financing and getting agreement on that. So I mentioned earlier about the $200 billion per year that's needed to restore biodiversity, and mobilizing that finance was not agreed amongst the governments that were present. But as I say, I've heard that conversation is continuing outside of COP or beyond COP16. I'd say that's the main the main letdown. The other was the main purpose of the meeting was for these governments to come together and share their national strategies and action plans. I think about half of the countries presented their national biodiversity targets and indicators, but it's only 44 countries out of the nearly 200 that submitted their full action plans and strategies. So I think it's fairly easy for governments to set targets, but it's much harder to draft a strategy and an action plan around those. So we're still waiting to see this, and that's what I meant earlier when I think governments need to show leadership and define those strategies. What does need to happen and who does have the plan for the planet and the plan for each country about how much forest do we have in each country and where should it be? How much salt marsh, how much of all our different habitats should there be? Where should they be in order to reach that 30 by 30 global goal? So that's what we need to see from governments. And then businesses and financial institutions can mobilize around that and have some confidence in their markets and what they're doing.
So 119 countries submitted the biodiversity targets, but only 44 submitted the national strategy and action plan. Why do you think is that? Because obviously acting to increase and improve biodiversity is very urgent. We have no time to waste, but on the other hand, there are still a lot of countries that are not able to submit those plans. Are those plans basically too complex? Are we missing some information? Are we missing some deeper understanding of why it is so urgent?
I think it is complicated. Ecosystems are complex. They vary from place to place. They vary through the year. And I think there's so many pressures on the natural environment from urban expansion, from farming and agriculture, and in the oceans from shipping and energy production, for example.
Fishing as well, yeah,
That's right, yeah, we want to eat. So I think there's a lot of pressures to tease out here. But also governments tend to operate on a short-term basis, don't they? That's just democracy. And policies, long-term policies, don't tend to be vote winners. So governments want to show short-term gains, don't they? So I think it's complex. The environment tends to be a bit lower down a government's agenda, but we see that in the public interest, there's a high public interest in the environment, in the climate, pollution in our rivers. I know for sure in the UK here, just before the election, water pollution from sewage overflow was a huge issue. So I think governments have to start listening, and they have to put their money where their mouth is and say that we need to step up. We need to take action right now. We need to set out the plans. So I hope they're going to follow through. It was disappointing that there was only a few countries had their strategies ready for COP16, but let's hope they follow through pretty quickly, the other countries.
How are you finding yourself in all of that as environmental specialists? I know that Ramboll has started the metrics. You are focusing on measuring the biodiversity. Can you say something more about this initiative? So I think that it's a good time to spend now on talking about how to measure biodiversity better.
But maybe I can, and you can talk more about the specific metrics, Sam. But just to say that from a Ramboll perspective, biodiversity, as Sam was also been, it's been part of what we've been doing almost as long as we've existed. It's been part of our focus. But I think in recent years we've really elevated it to one of sort of our core, actually one of our 4 key strategic themes. And that has been in recognition of, you could say, the state of the world and the pressure on nature. And that we felt as also being a responsible company and wanting to be a responsible part of society, that we needed to emphasize this, focus on this, and take special measures. And then, of course, also seeing some opportunities in terms of how the world moves, the legislation that's coming through, and also the the conversations that we are indeed having with our clients, both private and public, that they also want to make a difference here. So I think it has certainly been elevated on the agenda also within Ramboll, and we've created specific initiatives around it. And Sam is basically the one leading that for Ramboll. And it's been really interesting to see also just internally how much interest this has generated, how much excitement it is causing among our staff, among our partners. There is something around biodiversity which everyone can somehow relate to. Because we, just when we started off talking about how do each of us sort of relate to it, it is, on the one hand, nature is somehow intangible, because we all, it's always been there and we expect it to be there. But on the other hand, it's also, it's both intangible and tangible at the same time, because we can also just step outside and step, with bare feet in the grass in the summertime and all that. So it has that quality that we can all relate to it very directly, and we've all enjoyed being out in nature, I hope. But I think, again, as we talked about before, and that leads me perhaps handing over to you, Sam, the difference now is we're actually making it even more specific and tangible and science-based, in that we are increasingly being able to measure biodiversity, what it is, and thereby setting the baselines and how can you improve, and putting a value, even a financial value, to that. And that is a game changer, I think. And I'll hand over to you, Sam, to sort of give more details in terms of how we work on that, because it has indeed been an evolution, starting off in the UK, spurred by some of the sort of the really, I would say, front-running UK legislation that's been coming through. And then we sort of translated that into the Americas and now going global.
I'm curious about how you developed your understanding of biodiversity, and also how working with biodiversity kind of came to be a mainstream thing.
Have been lucky in the UK that our regulators have put biodiversity front and centre when it comes to development. So property development, also major infrastructure. And it is now mandatory in the UK for every development to come out with a net gain for biodiversity. And that's why the metric was developed by Natural England.
Can you just explain the term net gain to the listeners?
So that means that you have to look at the nature that is on your development site at the start, before you even start to design and plan, ideally. So you measure the baseline, and that's using this metric, which we can go into. So you measure the baseline, what's there currently. You then can come up with your design for what you want to build. You run that through the metric in terms of its footprint and where it's going to be on the site. And then the metric can predict what impact that would have upon nature. And so you basically then sort of, it's just simple maths, then you subtract the outcome from the baseline and you get a percentage change in terms of your nature. What we want, and what the legislation here in the UK says, is that you want a minimum 10% net gain in nature post-development. And you can go beyond that, but the minimum is 10%. So that means that every development is there to protect and restore nature on that particular site. And the emphasis is that the restoration and the protection happens on site, and it's only as a last resort that you can offset and create nature somewhere else.
How ambitious is that 10% goal in your opinion?
And it depends, answer, because it depends on what's there currently. So if you have a very rich and well-established habitat, for example, there are some habitats which are deemed irreplaceable. So that would be ancient woodland or peat bogs, for example, which take hundreds and thousands of years to restore. So there are some places where you just cannot build. But then it's a case of looking at what's there now. And if it's, for example, so we've been working with a business who have very large green campuses. They look beautiful. They're highly manicured. They have lots of horticultural, interesting plants. They've got bamboos that rustle in the wind, and they look very pretty. And the gardening team goes out every week in the summer and mows the grass. And they look lovely, but they're not providing much of a benefit for nature. So what we did was we went in and baseline measured the value of nature at those sites. We took out the invasive or non-native species, so the bamboos, for example. And then we developed a plan, a design, a landscape design for how those native plants could be increased, create more space, and manage the area for nature. We created ponds, for example, as well. And then we've measured or predicted what we think the outcome will be for nature. Now, in some of those locations, it's been quite difficult to achieve beyond the 10% because they were already, there were woodlands and things there already. But in other places, we've gone sort of 80% we can predict. So it depends, and that's where you have quite a low starting point. Because that particular company has set their target of an average of 20%. And they've got 50 sites around the world. So when you average it out, then they can achieve that 20% net gain.
How does it differ in Denmark?
We don't have a similar legislation yet, unfortunately, in Denmark. And personally, I think, and I'm sure you agree then, Sam, that it would be beneficial for us to have something similar, because it has really been driving positive change in the UK. And I think, you asked before about, whether the 10% is it ambitious or not. I think it is somehow ambitious because in the past and before this legislation, there was no real consideration of nature. The practice was that if you build, you just diminished whatever nature there was on the side. So I think it has really led to a consideration or a situation where you have to consider it in a much more structured way. And I think to Sam's point and your example, we sort of tend to look at, a green space is a green space. But I think the real key here is thinking, it's biodiversity. So the diversity piece is important, that, you need to make room for diversity in terms of species and plants, and especially what you referenced, Sam, sort of the native species is, of course, an important part of that. And I think what we've also found is that the sort of this interface that how we're working with, on the one hand, our biodiversity teams are biologists, the people that are experts in plant and species and all that, but then also having a very close collaboration, for instance, with our architects. We have a very renowned global architecture practice called Lassesen as part of the Ramboll group. And we work with them and with the landscape architects there to also embed it in their practices. So I think that having that sort of collaboration between scientists and architects and landscape architects is also a real game changer for us, because it means that we can embed this thinking at a much earlier stage. And I think that's actually also a difference that's come with the UK legislation, that you think about nature very early on in the planning stages, not as an afterthought once the building has been put in there. Oh, by the way, we need to create some green spaces and let's plant a little bit here and there. No, you are required to think about it early on. And it leads to a different way of thinking. It's not only then the green space and the space in between the buildings. It's also, how can you use facades? How can you use roofs? How can you, take excess water from the roofs and, lead it into the ponds? And so it's a really different way of thinking altogether, which has been super interesting, I think, also for our teams, and, created new creativity, new ways of designing and different types of collaboration. So, and our clients are typically the ones that engage with us on this are typically also super thrilled, because not only does it give them, the sites that are performing at a much different level, but also typically it does give them better buildings and spaces that their employees are really enjoying in a different way. And so there's so many positive aspects of it that you somehow, fail to understand why does not everyone just do it no matter what.
Speaking of collaboration, you've mentioned the example of you collaborating with Lassesen architects. But how can one incorporate the metrics that Ramboll has created? For example, let's focus on the Ramboll Global Biodiversity metric. Are those metrics open source? And is anyone, including your collaborators, your competitors, your clients, can use those metrics?
Absolutely. I think we took the decision early on, and that was led really by the UK regulator here who made the metric open source, is that we would do the same, because we need to act quickly as a global society to really meet the challenge that we have with the global biodiversity crisis. So we wanted to make the metric freely available. So you can download it from the Ramboll website. So if you Google Ramboll Measuring Nature, you'll find it. We have there also an America's biodiversity metric, which we published in April this year. And we have that covered just part of North America. But our colleagues since COP16 have been busy, and they've now covered another 30 states. So we've got most of North America and some of Central America covered in the metric. That will be coming along in January. And then we've also, that then was the stepping stone to creating this global biodiversity metric, which you can apply all around the world. So all those different types of ecosystems from the frozen north to the tropical zones in the middle and deserts, it will cover all of those.
Is the next step to apply those global metrics in the projects, or do you think there is need for some other types of metrics as well to be created first?
So this is a habitat-based metric. The Global Biodiversity Framework also requires us to consider species. And because of the, all the conservation policy that we've had for years now is very focused on species, there are metrics out there that look at species. But for the reasons I explained at the beginning, I think it's important to look at the habitat, and it's sort of conserving that and restoring that. So it's build it and they will come. So that's why our metric is, I think, one of the better ones, I would say that, because it's there to protect the whole habitat and ecosystem. But you also can qualitatively, and you should take into account species. If you've got protected species that use those sites and use those locations, you also need to ensure that you're protecting those. So that's done alongside in parallel.
Taking into consideration your work with the metrics and your attendance at COP16, what is your outlook on 2025? Do you feel like it will be a positive year in terms of biodiversity? There are still some concerns, as for example, the COP16 was not concluding.
I think we've got to be positive, haven't we? There's a conference coming up next year in Brazil, which will bring the climate and the nature agendas together. And I think certainly from the biodiversity side, we're seeing that as being really crucial. And what I'd really like to see is that the biodiversity COP and the climate COP are held together. I mean, they're held just 2 weeks apart, but they're held in locations on opposite sides of the world usually. Can we bring those together? Because we should be having the same conversation, because nature is part of solving the climate crisis. If you solve the nature crisis, you will solve the climate crisis as well. So I think we need to be bringing these two meetings together. So Mette, you've got some thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think, of course, when you sort of look around the world there, you could sort of say, oh, there's so many, we still see loss of habitats, we still see rainforest being diminished and nature being challenged in many places. I would also choose to be positive, because I really see, at least just from our little corner where we work, that there's so much interest in the topic of biodiversity, and so many of our clients and our partners that are wanting to have conversations with us around this and what they can do. Sometimes it's spurred by whatever commitments the company has made, reporting requirements, C-suite strategic decisions. Sometimes it's actually also really spurred by, requests from staff. So it's sort of a bottom-up thing. It's bubbling up in the organization that this is something that staff is really asking for companies to somehow address. Sometimes very specifically on the sites that they are, but even beyond that. So So I think there are many things that are coming, many movements that are coming together somehow. And also of recognition, as Sam says, that, that these agendas, you can't only focus on climate without, you also need to focus on biodiversity. And actually that by having that dual focus, you will, they are reinforcing each other and can support and supplement each other. And I think that's a positive trend that we really see. So I'm positive in terms of what we see and where things are moving.
That's a good spirit to have towards the end of this discussion, as we know there are many different challenges. But to inspire the listeners even more, I would love to ask you for a recommendation, ideally a book or maybe a report that could inspire listeners, and ideally that is connected to the topic of biodiversity.
So a book that's been out for a little while now, but I really enjoyed, it's called Wilding, and it's by Isabella Tree, who is a journalist. And it's about returning a British farm to nature. And they've taken principles from farms in the Netherlands. And it is a story, so it's told as a story. Very inspirational. And you could go and visit there. You can go glamping and stay at their farm. And I say, because it's coming up to Christmas, on my Christmas list is a book by Chloe Dalton called Raising Hare, which I believe she'd raised a leveret, a young baby hare. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I haven't read it yet.
Well, actually, maybe if you allow me, I also have two. As I would say, one book that made a big impression on me was the book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Volleden, where he sort of describes how trees are really, living in communities. They sort of act as families. They support their little ones. They share nutrients. And I think that was just really a very, very interesting take on nature and really an eye-opener for me. And I can only recommend it. And then I think the other one is and this is in Danish, and so it's of course probably limited for your listeners, but it's actually a book, or it's a tome of books, 14 books. It's called, if I translate it, it's called Den Lille Vilde in Danish, and it would be The Little Wild One. And it's actually about sort of foraging, how you go out in nature and collect plants and berries and things like that for eating, and how you can find different plants almost everywhere, and what you can use them for. And for me, reading that and using it also occasionally, I thought was really interesting, and also in a way a testament to some of these things and the relationship with nature, how that's changed in our modern age. Because if you go 100 years back, I'm sure a lot of what is captured in that book was common knowledge for a lot of people. That they would know that they could eat this plant and not that one. And you would actually have it as maybe part of somewhat a regular part of your diet, but in some way also become somewhat removed from nature and don't really have that knowledge beforehand or anymore. My grandparents lived on a farm in a rural part of Denmark, and my grandmother, she had that knowledge. She knew what she could pick in the forest. She knew the names of the plants and the flowers and the trees and the bees. And I think, unfortunately, we have lost some of that knowledge in a few generations, and I would hope that going forward we can maybe start to sort of pick up some of that again. That's my hope.
So we should relearn nature.
Yeah, I think so. Because you need also to know in order to somehow appreciate at a different level. So that would be my recommendation.
Mette and Sam, thank you very much for the recommendation, and I will add it to the episode description. Also the one in Danish, Den Lille Vilde. There is a big group of listeners listening from Denmark, so for sure it will be interesting to some of them, or to those of you who want to learn Danish. It's also a good way. And I will also add the link to the Ramboll's Measuring Biodiversity, so it can be found in the episode's description. And for now, I just wanted to thank you so much, Mette and Sam, for joining me here on the episode about a very important topic, which is biodiversity. Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast, together with Urban Land Institute Denmark and Samantha Deacon and Mette Lassesen as guests. And today we've discussed this crucial topic of biodiversity and how forums such as the Biodiversity Conference can influence the action of both public and private sectors. If you like this episode, please visit the social media of Urbcast, as you can find, for example, the article summarizing our discussion on my LinkedIn profile. Just go to linkedin.com/company/Urbcast. Thank you for listening and talk to you soon.